In the early moments of the congressional hearing, Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut confronts Education Secretary Linda McMahon with a question that cuts to the core of public service and policymaking. Did she ever pause to consider the children whose lives would be disrupted by her decisions? The exchange opens a window into a profound ethical dilemma facing government officials: the tension between bureaucratic authority, policy priorities, and the tangible, human consequences of decisions made behind the closed doors of Washington. Murphy begins by referencing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, a law that passed through Congress after extensive negotiation and collaboration between Democrats and Republicans. The act was designed not only to reform certain gun laws, but, critically, to fund school-based mental health services for children. This aspect of the legislation was widely recognized as essential, a lifeline for students grappling with trauma, crisis, and the challenges of growing up in a world marked by uncertainty and violence. The law allocated billions of dollars to programs across the country, ensuring that every state, regardless of political leanings, had the resources to support the mental health of its students. Yet, despite the careful planning and bipartisan support, Murphy points out that earlier this year, Secretary McMahon made a decision with far-reaching implications. She canceled $1 billion in ongoing grants to schools nationwide. These were not hypothetical funds or future allocations. These were active, existing grants. Murphy emphasizes that this is extraordinary because it is not standard practice for federal agencies to cancel programs midstream. Typically, when federal priorities shift, agencies phase out funding gradually, ensuring continuity for those who depend on it. By contrast, the decision to abruptly terminate these grants disrupted programs that children relied on every day. Murphy illustrates the impact with a poignant example from his home state of Connecticut. In Northwest Connecticut, a mental health program that had been funded through federal grants was providing critical support for children in crisis. When researchers surveyed the students involved in the program, asking them to identify the adult they would turn to in times of emotional distress, every single child named the same person: their counselor. This is not a generic bureaucratic metric or a line item in a budget report. It is a lived reality of children who had developed trust, connection, and a sense of safety through human relationships. The gravity of the decision becomes undeniable when Murphy frames it in concrete terms. With the cancellation of the grants, these students will arrive at school the following fall to find the adult who had been their anchor, their confidant, and their advocate no longer present. The counselor who had been at the center of their support network would be gone. The program that had offered structure, stability, and access to mental health resources would cease to exist. Murphy's questioning is precise and deliberate. He is not asking abstractly about budgets or policy priorities. He is asking whether McMahon considered the immediate harm to specific children whose trust had been placed in the people these programs funded. Secretary McMahon's responses, however, reveal a focus on process and administrative restructuring rather than the direct human impact Murphy highlights. She emphasizes a new simplified funding model that consolidates programs into a single grant to states, allowing local authorities to determine how the money should be used. While this approach may be defensible from an administrative standpoint, Murphy presses her repeatedly. How did she weigh the consequences for these particular children? What was the moral consideration in abruptly withdrawing support from students whose well-being depended on these programs? The tension in the exchange underscores a central lesson about governance. Policy decisions are not abstract. Every line item in a federal budget corresponds to a real person, a community, a life affected by the actions of government officials. When funding is abruptly withdrawn, it is not just programs that suffer. It is the trust and stability of children who are in vulnerable positions. By persistently asking whether McMahon considered the children of Northwest Connecticut, Murphy humanizes the policy debate, forcing viewers to confront the consequences of bureaucratic choices. The specificity of Murphy's questioning is critical. He does not speak in generalities about federal budgets or programmatic oversight. He references a particular program, a defined population, and a concrete metric: the counselor whom every child identified as the adult they trust most in crisis. This specificity transforms an abstract policy decision into a vivid narrative of potential harm. It emphasizes that when government officials make decisions about resource allocation, there is a moral dimension that cannot be ignored. Moreover, Murphy's approach illuminates the broader implications of midstream grant cancellations. Schools do not operate on the assumption that federal funds will disappear overnight. Hiring decisions, program development, and crisis response plans are built on the expectation of continuity. Abruptly severing funding not only disrupts services, it undermines trust, destabilizes communities, and potentially exacerbates the crises that these programs were designed to mitigate. When McMahon pivots to discussions about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, Murphy allows the contrast to speak for itself. The grants being terminated were intended to address mental health crises and provide support to students dealing with trauma. Yet, the rationale presented by the Secretary references ideological concerns rather than outcomes. This divergence highlights a critical tension in public administration: the alignment or misalignment between policy objectives and the lived experiences of those affected by those policies. Throughout the exchange, Murphy is relentless in returning to a singular question: did the decision-makers consider the children whose support systems were being dismantled? By insisting on this moral lens, Murphy emphasizes that accountability in governance is not solely a matter of legal authority or procedural correctness. It is about understanding and acknowledging the real-world impact of decisions on the lives of vulnerable populations. This moment exemplifies a broader principle that effective oversight requires specificity, empathy, and persistence. Murphy's questioning is neither theatrical nor performative. It is rooted in the principle that government exists to serve people, not the reverse. By translating a federal budget decision into the tangible consequences experienced by children in Northwest Connecticut, he forces a conversation about responsibility, human impact, and the ethical dimensions of policymaking. In conclusion, the first segment of this hearing serves as a powerful reminder of the human stakes behind bureaucratic decisions. It underscores the importance of grounding policy in both legal authority and moral consideration. Through the lens of children whose trusted counselors are abruptly removed, the abstract becomes visceral, and the consequences of federal action or inaction become impossible to ignore. Senator Murphy shifts from establishing the human stakes to dissecting the rationale behind Secretary McMahon's extraordinary decision. The tension is palpable. Murphy has established a human narrative grounded in trust, relationships, and tangible harm, and he now turns to the official explanation offered by the Department of Education. What unfolds is a study in contrast between administrative process and the lived realities of children who depend on consistent mental health support. Secretary McMahon frames the decision in terms of efficiency and program consolidation. She emphasizes that the department is moving toward a simplified funding structure, a single grant that states will manage to determine the best allocation for local needs. This argument is presented as both practical and forward-looking. Rather than overseeing multiple smaller programs, the federal government will empower states to prioritize resources according to local demand. At first glance, this may appear reasonable. Consolidation can reduce redundancy, streamline oversight, and theoretically improve the use of public funds. However, Murphy refuses to accept this as an answer in isolation. He meticulously returns to the specific children whose counselors were cut off mid-program, reiterating that no state-based consolidation or future grant structure will undo the immediate harm caused by the abrupt termination of existing funding. This is a crucial distinction that illuminates the ethical gap in McMahon's defense. Policy processes and administrative structures matter, but they do not replace the human relationships that were abruptly severed. Murphy's questioning underscores a fundamental principle of ethical governance: the difference between procedural correctness and moral accountability. McMahon's focus on future planning and state discretion ignores the present reality of students who are currently facing the loss of trusted adults in their lives. By repeatedly asking, "Did you think about these specific kids?" Murphy emphasizes that the human consequences of bureaucratic decisions cannot be deferred to abstract procedural frameworks. The moral question, the direct impact on vulnerable children, remains unaddressed. The Secretary attempts to broaden the justification by invoking concerns related to diversity, equity, and inclusion (DI) programs. She notes that some of the mental health programs being terminated dealt with gender issues and DI initiatives. This pivot introduces a secondary narrative. The federal government, she suggests, has a responsibility to ensure that grants are not being used to promote particular ideological or social agendas. While McMahon frames this as a legal and ethical oversight, Murphy quickly highlights the dissonance between these justifications and the core purpose of the grants in question. responding to mental health crises among children. Here, the contrast is striking. The programs being terminated were serving children in crisis, providing counseling and support to those experiencing trauma. Yet the rationale for their cancellation is framed around ideological concerns, DI, gender issues, and civil rights compliance, rather than outcomes related to mental health. Murphy's line of questioning implicitly asks the audience to consider a critical ethical question. When a government prioritizes abstract policy concerns over tangible, life-altering services, who bears the cost? In this case, the answer is clear: children, particularly those already vulnerable due to trauma or mental health challenges. Murphy's insistence on specificity also exposes a deeper structural issue in federal program management: the asymmetry of knowledge between bureaucrats and local practitioners. McMahon argues that state governors, principals, and superintendents are better positioned to determine how consolidated funds should be spent. While this may be administratively sound, it overlooks the fact that decisions made by federal officials can create irreversible disruptions before local authorities even have a chance to allocate resources. The consolidation offense fails to address the immediate harm to students who relied on a counselor funded by a grant that was terminated mid-year. The gap between administrative logic and human consequence becomes glaringly obvious. Moreover, the exchange reveals a subtle but critical point about trust and stability in public programs. Schools do not operate in a vacuum. Relationships between students and counselors are cultivated over time. Trust is fragile and cannot be reinstated through paperwork, consolidated grants, or bureaucratic restructuring. When federal funding is removed suddenly, the ripple effects extend beyond the immediate loss of a counselor. Crisis response plans, program continuity, and student mental health trajectories are disrupted. Murphy's line of questioning brings this disruption into stark relief, forcing both McMahon and the public to confront the tangible consequences of abstract policy decisions. Another layer of complexity emerges as Murphy challenges the ethical assumptions underlying McMahon's decision. He repeatedly frames a question in moral, rather than procedural, terms. Did you weigh the impact on these kids? By doing so, he emphasizes a principle often overlooked in bureaucratic governance. Policy decisions are inherently ethical acts. Every decision about resource allocation carries moral weight, particularly when it directly affects the well-being of vulnerable populations. Murphy's persistence in returning to the human consequences, rather than accepting process-oriented explanations, reinforces the central tension of this segment: the gap between administrative authority and moral responsibility. Throughout this exchange, the audience witnesses a subtle rhetorical strategy on Murphy's part. By isolating one program and describing its direct impact on individual children, he transforms what might otherwise be a dry policy debate into a compelling moral narrative. The power of specificity cannot be overstated. While McMahon speaks in abstractions, future grants, state discretion, program consolidation, Murphy speaks in names, relationships, and consequences. This contrast heightens the ethical stakes of the hearing, making the human cost of bureaucratic decisions unavoidable. McMahon's responses also highlight a recurring theme in governance: the tension between legality and morality. While she references civil rights compliance as a justification for the funding cuts, she does not address whether the abrupt cancellation was morally defensible given the foreseeable harm to children. Murphy exposes this tension by juxtaposing procedural compliance against human suffering. He implicitly asks whether legality alone is sufficient justification when decisions directly disrupt the lives of vulnerable children. The underlying question resonates far beyond this hearing. Can bureaucratic authority ever replace ethical consideration? The hearing format allows elected officials to hold executive branch decision-makers accountable not just for policy outcomes, but for the reasoning and morality behind their actions. By pressing McMahon on the impact of her decisions on real children, Murphy elevates the conversation beyond numbers, line items, and process charts. He demonstrates that oversight is most effective when it prioritizes human consequences, demanding that policy leaders confront the ethical dimensions of their authority. The tension in this segment also underscores the broader political stakes. Diversity programs in higher education have long been a focal point of debate, with critics arguing that some initiatives promote ideological conformity, while supporters stress the need for inclusion and equitable representation. By conflating DI programs with discriminatory practices and simultaneously promoting viewpoint diversity, the department is inserting itself directly into this ideological debate, leveraging the power of federal funding to shape institutional policy. Murphy's interrogation illuminates the dangers of such an approach. When enforcement of civil rights laws is expanded beyond their statutory purpose, it risks undermining both the credibility of the law and the autonomy of educational institutions. This segment also emphasizes the subtleties of political and legal argumentation. Murphy does not rely on hyperbole or partisan rhetoric. He systematically dismantles McMahon's justifications by focusing on statutory interpretation, practical consequences, and the ethical dimensions of authority. His questions are precise, legally grounded, and morally resonant, highlighting the importance of accountability when federal power intersects with civil liberties and academic governance. By the end of this exchange, the audience is left with clear understanding of the stakes. Decisions about higher education funding are not merely bureaucratic maneuvers. They shape the intellectual environment of the nation's universities, influence which ideas are promoted or marginalized, and set precedents for how federal agencies may exercise discretionary authority in the future. Murphy's questioning elevates the discussion from an abstract debate over ideology to a concrete consideration of governance, legality, and ethics. In conclusion, Segment 3 demonstrates the complex interplay between authority, legality, and ideology in higher education oversight. Murphy's interrogation reveals that even when officials act with ostensibly positive intentions, addressing anti-Semitism, promoting viewpoint diversity, the methods employed must remain grounded in statutory authority and ethical responsibility. The segment highlights the consequences of overreach, diminished institutional autonomy, chilling effects on academic freedom, and the potential misuse of civil rights enforcement as a tool for ideological control. In doing so, it reinforces the overarching theme of the hearing. Governance is not just about policy or process. It is about the responsible exercise of power in service of the public good. As the hearing continues, Senator Murphy intensifies his scrutiny of Secretary McMahon's approach to higher education oversight, shifting from ideological inconsistencies to the fundamental question of statutory authority. This segment examines how elected officials must reconcile the scope of their legal power with the ethical responsibility to act within those limits, a principle that underpins the rule of law in democratic governance. Murphy begins by zeroing in on a core issue. Under what authority does the Department of Education have the power to enforce ideological outcomes at institutions of higher learning? Citing the letter sent to Harvard University, Murphy highlights that the department demanded universities end all diversity programs while implementing viewpoint diversity. He presses McMahon to identify the statutory basis for these demands, emphasizing that federal agencies operate under powers explicitly delegated by Congress. Without such authority, any action risks being unlawful, arbitrary, or an overreach of executive power. McMahon responds by referencing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, claiming that the targeted programs violated civil rights law. She suggests that some diversity programs, by pitting one group against another, constitute a form of discrimination, and that the department's intervention was necessary to correct these violations. While addressing discriminatory practices is within the federal government's mandate, Murphy's line of questioning exposes a critical flaw. Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, not ideological composition or viewpoint diversity. The law was designed to protect students from unlawful discrimination, not to mandate ideological balance or define curricular content. The exchange highlights a subtle but profound distinction between authority and discretion. Federal agencies are empowered to enforce civil rights law and ensure compliance with legal statutes, but this authority does not extend to reshaping institutional policies according to the personal or political preferences of executive officials. Murphy's questioning underscores the danger of conflating enforcement with ideological enforcement. Without explicit statutory backing, such actions risk undermining the integrity of both the law and the institutions being regulated. Murphy's interrogation strategy is methodical and precise. He does not engage in partisan rhetoric. Rather, he focuses on legal interpretation and practical implications. He asks McMahon repeatedly, where in the statute is the authority granted to dictate the ideological composition of a university or its faculty? The question forces viewers and the secretary herself to confront the boundaries of executive power. By keeping the discussion anchored in statutory language, Murphy frames the issue not as a political dispute, but as a matter of constitutional governance and accountability. McMahon's responses attempt to shift the focus from statutory authority to outcomes, emphasizing discussions with university leadership and efforts to eliminate anti-Semitism. While these concerns are valid, Murphy's questioning makes clear that the ends cannot justify the means if the means lack legal grounding. Threatening to withhold federal funding based on perceived deficiencies in viewpoint diversity does not have a clear legal basis, and therefore constitutes an overreach of executive authority. This segment also explores the broader implications of executive overreach. If federal agencies are allowed to interpret civil rights laws expansively to enforce ideological conformity, it sets a precedent with far-reaching consequences. Universities could be pressured to adjust hiring, curricula, and programming to avoid funding penalties, creating a chilling effect on academic freedom. Faculty may self-censor, administrators may prioritize compliance over educational integrity, and students could be deprived of exposure to a full spectrum of ideas. Murphy emphasizes that such consequences are not theoretical. They represent tangible disruptions to the core mission of higher education and the democratic principles that underpin it. The hearing underscores the importance of checks and balances. Congressional oversight exists precisely to hold executive officials accountable when they attempt to stretch or reinterpret statutory authority beyond its intended scope. Murphy's questioning demonstrates that oversight is not simply about monitoring compliance. It is about enforcing limits, ensuring transparency, and protecting the rights of individuals and institutions from arbitrary administrative action. In this context, the hearing becomes not just a procedural exercise, but defense of democratic governance itself. Murphy also raises a subtle ethical dimension. By targeting programs and institutions under ambiguous interpretations of civil rights law, the department risks imposing consequences on communities, students, and faculty who are not legally at fault. This is analogous to the earlier discussion of children losing mental health counselors. In both cases, the actions of government officials have direct human consequences. Whether it is a counselor abruptly removed from a student in crisis or a university forced to dismantle programs, the ethical question remains the same. Should administrative power be exercised without clear legal authority when it can harm vulnerable populations? The exchange further highlights a critical tension between process and principle. McMahon emphasizes procedural engagement, discussions with university leadership, suggestions for program improvement, but these steps do not substitute for statutory authorization. Murphy's relentless questioning reinforces the idea that good intentions or procedural processes cannot legitimize actions that exceed legal authority. In governance, legality is a baseline. Moral and procedural considerations must operate within that framework, not in place of it. By the end of Segment 4, the audience gains a clearer understanding of the stakes involved in federal oversight. Murphy's approach illustrates the importance of grounding executive action in law, of questioning ambiguous interpretations, and prioritizing both legal and ethical responsibility. The segment reinforces a central theme of the hearing. Authority carries responsibility, and power without clear legal grounding can produce harm, whether to children in schools or to universities navigating complex social and educational mandates. In conclusion, this segment serves as a powerful examination of the limits of federal authority. Murphy's interrogation exposes a tension between ambition and law, highlighting how overreach, whether in funding decisions or regulatory enforcement, can have tangible, adverse consequences. By demanding clarity, specificity, and accountability, the hearing underscores the principle that effective governance requires not only power, but restraint, legality, and ethical consideration. Senator Murphy has systematically established two critical narratives. First, the abrupt termination of mental health grants has direct, measurable effects on children who relied on these programs. Second, the Department of Education's enforcement actions regarding higher education programs raise questions about the legal and ethical limits of executive power. Segment 5 draws these threads together, examining the broader consequences of policy decisions, the human toll of administrative overreach, and the fundamental principles of accountability in governance. Murphy begins by returning to the human dimension of the mental health funding cuts, emphasizing that the consequences are not abstract or distant. Schools and counselors do not operate in a vacuum. They are embedded in communities where children depend on relationships, routine, and continuity of care. By abruptly withdrawing grants, the department has not only eliminated critical services, but also disrupted the stability and trust upon which these programs were built. The example from Northwest Connecticut illustrates this vividly. Every child in the program identified the same counselor as the one adult they would turn to in times of crisis. When that counselor is removed, it is not merely a programmatic loss. It is a disruption of the very social and emotional scaffolding that sustains vulnerable children. This segment underscores a key ethical principle. Policy decisions have moral consequences that must be acknowledged and weighed. Murphy's repeated questioning highlights the tension between administrative authority and moral responsibility. While McMahon emphasizes procedural considerations, grant consolidation, state discretion, and efficiency, these justifications fail to account for the immediate harm to children whose well-being depended on the programs being terminated. The dissonance between process and impact demonstrates a critical lesson for policymakers. Efficiency and legality, while important, cannot substitute for ethical consideration when human lives are affected. The conversation then transitions to higher education, reinforcing connection between procedural authority and real-world consequences. Murphy presses McMahon on the department's actions regarding Harvard and Columbia, focusing on the enforcement of viewpoint diversity under the threat of withholding federal funding. Here, the consequences are different, but no less significant. Academic freedom, institutional autonomy, and intellectual diversity are threatened when federal authorities overstep their legal mandate. Universities may alter curricula, reshape faculty composition, or suppress certain viewpoints to avoid punitive action, undermining the very principles that underpin higher education. Murphy's questioning emphasizes that overreach, even with ostensibly good intentions, can have ripple effects that compromise both governance and public trust. A central theme in this segment is the concept of foreseeable harm. In both contexts, the mental health programs and the higher education directives, Murphy draws attention to the fact that the outcomes of these decisions were predictable. Children would lose access to trusted counselors. Universities would face pressure to conform ideologically. When harm is foreseeable, ethical and legal responsibility is heightened. Policymakers cannot shield themselves behind abstract objectives or procedural technicalities. They must account for the tangible consequences of their actions. Murphy's approach exemplifies this principle, forcing McMahon to confront the real-world effects of her decisions rather than remain in the abstract domain of policy justification. Another dimension explored in this segment is the intersection of law, policy, and morality. McMahon repeatedly frames her actions within procedural and legal narratives, citing civil rights statutes and programmatic oversight. Murphy, however, challenges this framing by demonstrating that legality alone does not resolve the ethical dilemma. The law may authorize certain oversight actions, but it does not necessarily justify causing disruption or harm when alternatives exist. This is particularly salient in the mental health context, where incremental adjustments or phased program changes could have mitigated harm, yet the department chose abrupt termination. The contrast illustrates a critical governance principle. Effective policy requires both legal grounding and ethical foresight. Murphy also highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in public administration. When federal decisions affect vulnerable populations, those affected have a right to understand a rationale and to have their interests considered. The abrupt termination of grants, combined with a lack of a clear moral or ethical justification, raises questions about whether the Department of Education adequately considered the voices and needs of those most directly impacted. The hearing thus serves as a case study in the necessity of procedural fairness, stakeholder engagement, and accountability in policy implementation. As the hearing reaches its final stages, the overarching themes of discussion come into sharp focus. The relationship between executive authority, statutory limits, and the human consequences of policy decisions. Throughout the exchange, Senator Chris Murphy has highlighted two critical areas where Secretary McMahon's decisions raise profound questions: the abrupt termination of mental health funding for children and the Department of Education's ideological enforcement in higher education. Segment 6 synthesizes these discussions, examining the lessons of governance, accountability, and the ethical exercise of power. At the core of this hearing is a moral question. How should government balance the authority to act with the responsibility to protect vulnerable populations. Murphy's interrogation of McMahon underscores the human stakes behind policy choices. In Northwest Connecticut, children lost access to the counselor they trusted most in moments of emotional crisis. Across the country, students relied on programs that were abruptly dismantled, not due to inefficiency or ineffectiveness, but because of administrative and ideological considerations. By highlighting these tangible consequences, Murphy transforms abstract policy debates into a compelling human narrative. He forces both officials and the public to confront the reality that government actions are not neutral. They shape lives, relationships, and communities. The hearing also illuminates a central tension in governance, the interplay between legality and morality. McMahon repeatedly frames her actions within the boundaries of procedural authority and statutory interpretation, citing Title VI and civil rights enforcement as justification for her decisions regarding higher education. However, Murphy demonstrates that legality alone is insufficient. The abrupt termination of mental health programs, justified by procedural efficiency or concerns about DI content, illustrates that legal authority cannot excuse the ethical implications of disrupting lives. This dual focus on law and ethics highlights a fundamental principle of public service. Authority must be exercised with both legality and humanity in mind. Another critical lesson emerging from the hearing is the importance of specificity in oversight. Murphy does not speak in abstractions. He references concrete examples, specific programs, and identifiable individuals affected by the decisions. This approach not only clarifies the consequences of policy, but also humanizes the discussion, making it impossible for officials to hide behind generalities. The contrast between McMahon's procedural responses and Murphy's pointed focus on human outcomes underscores the power of specificity and accountability. By tying policy to real-world consequences, oversight becomes a tool not merely for procedural compliance, but for moral and ethical guidance. Segment 6 also explores the limits of executive power, particularly in the context of higher education. The department's actions regarding Harvard and Columbia raise questions about the proper scope of federal authority, the interpretation of civil rights statutes, and the potential misuse of funding leverage to enforce ideological conformity. Murphy's questioning reveals that even well-intentioned actions, such as promoting viewpoint diversity or addressing discrimination, must operate within the boundaries of law. Overreach, whether through abrupt funding cuts or ideological mandates, risks eroding institutional autonomy, chilling intellectual discourse, and undermining public trust in governance. This segment reinforces a critical principle. Power ungrounded in law or ethics can produce harm, even when the intention is positive. The hearing also emphasizes the foreseeable consequences of policy decisions. In both cases, the termination of mental health grants and enforcement of viewpoint diversity, the outcomes were predictable. Children would lose trusted support. Universities would face pressure to alter programs and faculty composition. By highlighting foreseeability, Murphy underscores the ethical responsibility of policymakers to anticipate and mitigate harm. Accountability, in this sense, is not merely about adherence to procedure, but about proactively considering the ripple effects of policy on individuals, communities, and institutions. A further theme that emerges is the ethical responsibility of leadership. Effective governance is measured not solely by efficiency, compliance, or political objectives, but by the impact of decisions on those most affected. Murphy's persistent focus on children in crisis and the consequences for higher education institutions serves as a reminder that leadership carries moral weight. Decisions may be legally defensible, procedurally sound, or politically expedient. Yet if they fail to consider human welfare, they risk undermining the very purpose of public service. This segment emphasizes that human-centered decision-making is not optional. It is an essential component of ethical governance. Segment 6 also draws attention to the role of congressional oversight as a check on executive power. Murphy's approach demonstrates that hearings are not merely performative exercises. They are mechanisms to ensure that government actions are grounded in law, ethics, and human consideration. By pressing officials to account for both the consequences of their actions and the legal basis for their authority, oversight serves as a critical safeguard against arbitrary or harmful decision-making. This hearing exemplifies how accountability can protect vulnerable populations, uphold institutional integrity, and reinforce the principles of democratic governance. Finally, the segment synthesizes the broader lessons of the hearing for the public and policymakers alike. First, decisions in government are inherently human decisions. Budgets, statutes, and programs ultimately affect real lives. Second, legal authority alone does not justify action. Ethical responsibility and foresight are essential to ensure that decisions do not inflict harm. Third, oversight and accountability are crucial mechanisms for maintaining the balance between power and responsibility. Together, these lessons provide a framework for understanding not only the specific issues raised in this hearing, but the broader principles that should guide all public decision-making. Governance is measured by its impact on people. Senator Murphy's line of questioning illustrates that public service demands more than adherence to procedure or interpretation of law. It requires moral clarity, foresight, and a commitment to the welfare of those affected. Whether considering children in need of mental health support or universities navigating complex social and educational landscapes, the fundamental question remains the same. Does this decision protect, serve, and consider the lives of those it touches? By holding Secretary McMahon accountable to this standard, the hearing reaffirms the essential principle that the exercise of power carries both legal and moral responsibility, and that the human dimension must always remain central in governance.